I would like to sketch with you a profile, a picture of one man who in my eyes personifies this most. You're familiar with the fact that Sefer Bereshis, the book of Genesis, is divided into two halves. The first half deals with Adam, Adam, Noach, and the three patriarchs and the matriarchs of Israel: Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, Leah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, Leah. The second half of Bereshis is reserved for one person. The hero of the second half of the book, Vayeshev, Miketz, Vayigash, Vayechi, is reserved to one individual, and his name is Yosef, Joseph. His story occupies almost half the book, and it concludes at the conclusion of Bereshis this week, the conclusion of Vayechi, Chazak. I want to ask one question about this man. When he meets his brothers after 22 years of a bitter separation, and he finally reveals his identity to them, he forgives them. He tells them, don't be depressed, don't get angry. Really? They shouldn't be depressed? They shouldn't get angry? He is the victim. They are the perpetrators. Whoever heard a victim telling perpetrators, you don't get angry, you don't get depressed? They're the ones who threw him into a pit. They sold him into slavery. They separated him from his father for more than 2 decades. And when he meets them and tells them, I'm Joseph, the next thing he says, Va'ata al teyotzvu. Don't be distressed. Don't worry about it. It's all good. They should be pleading with him not to get depressed or angry. Instead, they are overwhelmed, terrified, horrified, and he relaxes them. He tells them it's fine. Don't worry about it. How does one achieve that level of equilibrium, that level of serenity, to be able to create reconciliation? I know siblings who don't talk to each other, not because one of them was thrown into a pit and sold into slavery, but for other reasons. And for 20 years, they don't talk to each other. And it's sad. And here Joseph forgives his brothers. How does he do it? What was his secret? What could we learn from it? There's something equally strange I want to raise this evening, and that is, when Yosef is in prison for 12 years, one morning the Torah says, in Parshas Vayeshev, he sees Pharaoh's butler and baker in the morning in prison, Vihinam Zoafim. They look downtrodden, melancholy, dejected. They have sour faces. What does Yosef tell them? 4 words. Madua pneichem rayim hayom. Why do you look so lousy today? Why are you so sad? Why don't you look good? And they tell them they had these dreams and they don't know how to explain the dreams, and that's why they're sad, they're depressed. One wonders about this question of Yosef. It's morning in a dungeon in Egypt. He sees 2 Egyptian ministers of Pharaoh, downtrodden and depressed. And he says, Madua pneichem rayim hayom. Why are you sad? What type of question is this? I go into shul 6 or 7 in the morning. Most people look depressed. This guy didn't have his coffee yet. This guy didn't take his vitamins. This guy wasn't in the gym. This guy's not interested in being here. This guy didn't wake up yet. This guy woke up on the left side. This guy was thrown out of his house. Whatever. You don't ask questions early in the morning to Jews. Why do you look like you have a sour face? On the contrary, if somebody looks too happy, everybody wants to know, what are you taking? It's not normal. But this is not even a shul. He asks a question. And I would tell him, Yosef, really? Because we're waiting for death row in an Egyptian cell, for heaven's sake, genius. What type of question is this? What is this? What are they eating, sushi or cheesecake at a bar mitzvah or a wedding? One of them was waiting on death row in a prison. What should they be doing? Dancing kazatskas? What type of question is this? Madua pneichem royim hayom. Why are you so sad? What is more, what would your grandmother say if she saw them depressed? She would say, "Have aleph von Zegezagavara." Fine, big deal. Yosef cares. He wants to know why they're sad. And then the biggest question is about himself. What about he? If you would give a therapist here in the 5 towns, for Rockaway, a resume of Yosef's life. At 9, he lost his mother. At 17, he was kidnapped by his brothers, thrown into a pit with scorpions. Then he was sold as a slave for life. Then he was accused of promiscuity, and he was innocent. And he was thrown into prison. Yosef is the epitome. What's that line? No good deed goes unpunished. Never happened to you? No good deed goes unpunished. Whatever he does right, he gets punished for. He listens to his father. His father says, go visit your brothers. Because he could have told his father, Tati, they don't like me. Go find somebody else. Because he listens to his father, this is what happens to him. He gets thrown into a pit. He says no to the wife of Potiphar. He says, Vayimoin, I will not betray you. I will not betray your husband. I will not betray God. And he gets thrown into prison. He does a favor for the butler and he says, remember me, and the man forgets him. Whatever he does right, he gets stabbed in the back. Such people become bitter, resentful, angry, full of vengeance, full of ire. They're miserable people. You ever meet such people? Present company excluded. Yosef turns to him and says, guys, why are you not happy? As though he's this jolly, happy-go-lucky, free, frivolous, uninhibited, Amachaya. His life is an exercise in blissful paradise. Anybody who would see a resume of his life would say, this kid is a depressed kid. You know, he cries most in the Tanakh. 8 times he cries in the Tanakh, which means his emotions are not stuffed. He doesn't suffer from emotional constipation. He has open emotions. He's always crying. He was always in touch with his emotions. Some people lock up their emotions. That's how they survive. Some of us grew up in such homes. Emotions get locked up. That's how many Jews have survived. The only emotion that they stayed with was guilt. Somebody asked me, what's the definition of a Jew? And I said, if he doesn't feel guilty, he blames himself. And when he makes a fist, the next step is Hashamnu, Bagadnu, Bazamnu, Banadayf. What was the secret of this man? The truth is, it's all in one word. It's all in one word. And it's this word I want to share, I want to present, I want to capture and explain tonight. When he meets his brothers, he uses the same word 3 times. In Parshas Vayigash, which is how you know it's so significant. He says, you did not sell me. Atem loy mechartem oisi. Ki lemichya shlachani elikim lefneichem. Hashem, God, sent me. And then he repeats it, Vayishlacheni elikim. God sent me, and he says it a third time. In 4 psukim, he says the same word 3 times. Loy atem shalachtem oisi kiyim elikim. You didn't send me, God, the Rebbeinu Shalom, Hashem sent me. You didn't sell me, God sent me. It's not just a contrast between who did it, it's also a contrast between selling or sending. What's the difference between sending or selling? If I sell something, I sell a home, I sell a car, I sell a computer, a business, a website, whatever I sell, the object that is being sold is a passive victim. It has no say in the transaction. It's just sold. It's a ping pong ball. It was here today, and tomorrow it's by you. I make the money, and you have it. That's what a sale is. When I send somebody on a shlichus, when I send somebody on a mission, you're having Gemara in Kiddushin, shluchoi shel adam k'moisai. When I send somebody on a mission, first of all, I have to evaluate that this person is worthy of this particular mission. I have to first estimate and evaluate, is this person good for this mission? I send them with the intention because I know that they he or her can accomplish this particular mission, and therefore I appoint them as my ambassador, as my representative, as my emissary, as my shliach to do this mission. It's a completely different type of relationship. So Yosef says, I was not sold. I was sent. He can't change the facts. We can't always change the facts of our life. Yosef can't look back and say, it never happened. At 17, I was not sold as a slave. I was not thrown into a dungeon. I did not spend 12 years in prison. I was not separated from my father for 22 years. He cannot deny those facts. The facts are facts. What Yosef does is, and in that sense, he is perhaps the first reframer in history. He doesn't change the facts of his life, he reframes them. All of you know you can put up a painting, a portrait, a picture, but it doesn't have the right frame. You get the right frame, we call it in psychology reframing. He can't alter the facts, but he can reframe them. How does he reframe them? He says, I was not sold. I was sent. Meaning, even though you did what you did and it was painful, but I wasn't a ping pong ball who was thrown here, thrown there. No. God evaluated who I am, and he sent me as his ambassador to every single place I ended up in order to bring love, light, hope to that particular place, in order to transform darkness into light. I know what I went through, and I know that it was painful, but I was not sold. I was sent. If I was sent, the entire attitude, the entire perspective is transformed. The story is reframed. When we look at our own lives, friends, many of us sitting in this room, some I know, some I don't know, we know our lives. We can't always change the facts of our past. Some of us have been through difficult situations. Some of us still endure difficult situations. There are people here who has children already, endured much pain, whether it was physical, emotional, psychological, social, spiritual. Sometimes pain caused by other people intentionally or unintentionally. I cannot choose to change what happened. But one question I and you have to answer yourself, and that is, were you sent or were you sold? If you look at yourself as sold, you were a ping pong ball. And some of us perceive our lives as that. We were thrown here and thrown there. If I was sent, I may have been sent to dark places, but God evaluated my neshama and he appointed me as his ambassador to those places in order to be able to find meaning there, to bring hope there, to bring light into a place of darkness. Ambassadors don't always end up in sweet places. Some ambassadors are dispatched on difficult and challenging missions. But because they're ambassadors, they know that they weren't sent here just as sold. They're not victims. They were sent on a mission. Some of us wake up in the morning carefree. Others wake up in the morning, and the first moment you wake up, you're bombarded with depressing and difficult thoughts. And you can't get rid of them. And you ask yourself the question, what do I do with this? And the response Yosef tells us is, I can't get rid of these thoughts, but I have to answer this question. Was I sold or was I sent? If I was sold, I'm just a victim of overwhelming circumstances and situations that constantly overwhelm my life. If I was sent, it means that God has chosen my soul to enter into all of these places, physically, conceptually, emotionally, psychologically, knowing that I have the power to be an ambassador of love, of light, and of hope. It was a few hours before Pesach. I should say a few minutes before last year Pesach. I was in a hotel for Pesach, for Passover. And I was conducting a public seder, a very large seder with a lot of people. And it was pretty stressful. And there was a lot of work for preparation. So I knew that Pesach Jews don't stop eating because we have to compensate for the fact that there's no chametz. So therefore we make sure to eat a lot. So I decided that the right thing to do is to go to the gym right before Pesach comes. So I come in, and of course I go on the bicycle, so I could also check my emails and read a book and not get too involved. And I'm bicycling, and I'm proud of myself, and I'm checking some emails, and I get an email, it's mamish before Pesach. A woman writes an email to me. She says, "Dear Rabbi Jacobson, I hate Jewish holidays." Okay, welcome to the club, who doesn't? Why does she hate Jewish holidays? Because of the obsession with food. She says she has a big issue with eating, and all Jewish holidays focus exclusively on food. And she can't deal with it. Comes the Seder, and the matzah, and the charoises, and the murr, and the koirich, and the eggs, and the onions, and the potatoes, and the celery, and matzah again, and then more matzah, and then sandwich matzah, and afikoyman matzah, and this matzah, and then a whole meal. I just can't deal with it. Could you help me? It's right before Pesach. What am I supposed to do? What am I supposed to do? I thought, it needs a longer discussion, a longer conversation. I thought I'll answer it Chol HaMoed, I'll answer it after Pesach. It was already time to go to shul, daven mincha, get ready for the Seder. But then I looked at the phone, I thought, you know what? You never know what she's thinking. Let me write a brief answer. So as I'm bicycling, I write this brief answer, and I say, listen, you're right. We do have an issue with food. We have a dysfunctional relationship with food. It's true. Not all of us, but many of us. You're supposed to eat in order to live. Many of us live in order to eat. That's true. We live in order to be able to eat. And all the holidays have the same message. They tried to kill us. We won. Let's go eat. More or less. This time it's latkes, then it's hamantashen. I was sitting with the president of Brooklyn College, so she wanted to know why there's so many latkes and donuts on Hanukkah. She went to this party. She's not Jewish. So I said, very simple. Hanukkah is the victory of the Jews against the Greeks. The Greeks were into 4 things: exercise, fashion, looks, and sports. So we eat latkes and donuts to make sure that we don't look like that. We want to stay as far as possible from the Greeks. Okay, sure. So I write to her, we have an issue with food, it's true. And the focus of all our Shabbos and holidays are food. And even Yom Kippur, that one day a year when finally we serve God through not eating, there's a huge mitzvah to eat right before and right after. And all day Jews are talking about food. So even Yom Kippur is also about food. It's just not eating. So I said, I empathize with you, I understand. And I know how I look. I'm a victim of this philosophy and this theology as well. But I want to tell you that this is part of our dysfunction we have to heal from, and it's not the essence of Passover. So let me tell you what to do. Take a little piece of matzah. You have to eat 1 kazayas. A kazayas is an olive. A kazayas is not a 747, although it became that way. Kazayas is the size of an olive. We're very stringent and holy Jews, so we took a kazayas and we turned it into a watermelon. But an olive is an olive. Take a matzah, take a little piece of a matzah, and eat it, and you're done. You're done. You did the mitzvah of matzah. Take a piece of lettuce or 2 pieces of lettuce, romaine lettuce. You did the mitzvah of maror, and you're good. And I said, if it's hard for you, you don't have to stay at the table. You could go read a book about the Exodus of Egypt, so you'll fulfill the mitzvah of telling the story. Relax, meditate. Don't drive yourself crazy. Try to become free this Pesach. It's good. And I said, we'll continue the conversation, Chol HaMoed. I saw this anxiety. I thought it's the right thing. I sent over the email. I jumped to get dressed for Pesach, and 5 minutes later, I forgot about it. A month later, literally a month and a half later, 6 weeks later, I get an email. I was actually also in the gym back home. See how often I go. And I get this email. I open it up. It's this lady, and she writes to me. My mama started to shiver. She says, you probably didn't know what you accomplished when you send that email moments before the holiday. It's more of a complex story. And she writes to me her whole story, a very painful story. A story of tremendous abuse in her childhood. A story of mental challenges in a very profound way. A glowing, sensitive soul and a brilliant writer, but somebody who's been through tremendous challenges. And she says to me, one of her great challenges is also, besides everything else, anorexia. Besides everything else, and depression. And she has a husband and a few children, beautiful children. She says, the pain of my life nobody ever understood. For me to live is literally to be in a hellish crucible. Life is about pain. And it was before Pesach, and I went shopping in Manhattan, and I was on the way home, and I was standing and waiting for number 6 train. And my life was so full of pain, I just wanted to get rid of the pain. And I saw that in 3 minutes a train is coming. And I decided it's enough. I suffered too much. I'm jumping into the tracks, and my soul will be snuffed out momentarily, and everything will be done. I won't even feel pain, and my life will be finished, and finally I'll have a moment of serenity. I have sent you earlier that day this email because of my anxiety with Pesach. I'm standing there, and I'm getting ready to take this plunge, literally a plunge into the abyss. And the train is soon coming, and suddenly I hear the sound when you get an email. And it's right before the holidays, so I open up the phone, and I open it, and I see Rabbi YY Jacobson sent me an email. And I read your email, and it was cute, it was humorous, it was charming, you made fun of yourself, you made fun of all the Jews, you made fun of food, you told me to chill out. And she said, I thought to myself, everybody is busy before Pesach. If this rabbi thought that it was worthwhile to write me an email, that means he really believes I have value. I'm not going to kill myself. And she said it gave me a pause enough to call my husband and say, come save your wife. She says, I'm alive today because of that. You should know that the email wasn't an email. The email saved a life. As I was reading it, I was trembling because I realized, had I not received her email, in my wildest dreams, I would have not imagined this consequence. I was just recently in Israel, and I met some great people. I also met the Tolner Rebbe Shlita. The Tolner Rebbe communicated a very profound idea. There's really 2 different perspectives on life. Every one of us ends up in our own little purgatories, whatever they are. Life in exile is not perfect. And when we go to those places, when we end up in those places, sometimes every day, sometimes once a week, sometimes unexpected, I have to answer one question. Was I sold? Am I a slave? Am I a hopeless victim who ended up in those challenging situations? Or was I sent? And that changes the entire story. It reframes the very facts and confers upon it a whole different experience, a whole different perspective. That is why Joseph could be in prison and turn to 2 Gentiles who are depressed and say, Madua pnechem rayim ayai? Why are you sad? He didn't have a problem with his own happiness. Why? Because he never saw himself as sold. His brothers did it. From his perspective, they did wrong. But he understood that the divine God sent him. And that completely transformed his reality. I had the opportunity today, you just heard from Getzel. I had the privilege of his father, Mordechai Rabashin, coming to visit me in my home today. And we sat for a few hours. And I asked him what was his most difficult moment. I went to visit him quite a few times in prison. And the prison he was sitting in was not an easy prison. No prison is easy, but some prisons are more like camp. They play volleyball, they smoke cigarettes, they schmooze, etc. But he was in a prison like some of you saw in the movies. a real dungeon, a real cell. And I've seen it with my own eyes. The gates come down, you're in lockdown, he was put in solitary. I mean, it's a very, very difficult situation. He said, one day, it was a holiday, it was a Yom Tov. And he wanted to say a little l'chaim. So he asked the chaplain, Rabbi Richter in Otisville, if he could get him a little grape juice. Grape juice is legal. So he got him a little grape juice. Shine. He has the grape juice in his cell, and he's talking to God, and he says a little l'chaim in honor of the holiday. This is before a minyan, no shul, nothing. He was mamash alone. Suddenly, there's an alarm. Somebody was caught doing something, making some trouble. There's a sudden inspection in all the cells. They inspect, they go in, and they find the grape juice. Now, grape juice is not illegal. They tell him you're going into solitary confinement. Why? They said it's probably not grape juice. You probably found a way to concoct the grape juice into vodka. A chassid, right? Into mashka. That's illegal. He said, it's not grape juice. No. They made tests, and they threw him into solitary confinement. You're allowed to speak to your lawyer. So his lawyer, a guy named Gary, who also shared it with me, he speaks to Gary. And Gary says, I'm so sorry, we're going to fight this. We're going to get you out as soon as possible. Mordechai says, no, actually, it turned out to be pretty good. He says, what are you talking about? Sugar? Now you really lost it? He says, I'll tell you. In solitary confinement, I met a Jew who I never met before. He never put on tefillin, and I made him a bar mitzvah in solitary confinement. I put tefillin on him. So it's actually a good thing. Now I'm ready to get out of here. But it's actually a good thing. So Mordechai looked at me and said, Rabbi Jacobson, I want to tell you something. I know it's America and it's not going to sound so popular. In the prison where I was in, they try to make you lose your sense of humanness. And he described to me different things. No, they don't torture you, Baruch Hashem, it's America, not the Soviet Union. But you lose your human identity. 8 years, day and night, you lose your humanness. And that was for me the biggest challenge. So I said, Nu, what did you do? So he said, I had to be in a space that's above the prison. I said, how can you be in a space that's above the prison? So he said, at every moment, I had to live with God who transcends prison, and then I can also transcend prison. And that's why when I came out, I didn't feel like a prisoner. And you'll see an interesting thing. Usually when somebody was in prison for 8 years, not in a camp, in a real cell, dalit al dalit, with a tiny bed and a tiny bathroom for 8 years, when you go from one room to another room, you have 5 minutes, and if you miss it, you're in lockdown for hours, where your food is very limited and your movements every moment are limited. The only way he was allowed to daven in the chapel is he was given the job of being a janitor in the chaplain, and therefore he could go to the shul to daven as a janitor, and then when time was up, you go back to your cell. Your emails are limited, everything, visits. The only way a person can do this, when you do it for 8 years, you come out, I don't know if you've ever seen, you could see a person was in prison for a long time. You could see it. You could see it on their demeanor. You could see it on how they carry themselves. You could see it on their spirits. You could see it. Nonetheless, take a look at all the videos, all the WhatsApps. Doesn't look like a guy who just came out 5 minutes earlier from prison. Because physically he was in prison, emotionally and mentally he saw himself as a shliach. So he wasn't there. Physically he was there with all the pain like Joseph. That's what I told him today. But mentally, spiritually, conceptually, he was connected to a reality that transcends even solitary confinement. Sure, it's easy to speak about this from this side of the wall. But when I went to visit him on that side of the wall, I was there for 3 hours a little while ago, and we davened Ma'ariv. He asked me if we could do Ma'ariv, because usually doesn't have a minyan. We finished Ma'ariv. I gave him a hug and a kiss. I said shalom to the other Jews there, and then it was time to leave. As I was leaving, it was very sad emotionally, because I'm going home and I'm leaving him behind. I didn't know that in a few weeks he'll be out. He knew, I didn't. He hoped, I didn't know. And he looks at me and he says, well, I said, you're leaving? I said, yeah, what do you want me to do? He says, I don't understand you. I said, what? He says, a tencel? You don't leave without dancing. He asks me to dance. So we started to dance. In the cell we started. You want to know why in Borough Park, why in Monsey, why in Lakewood, why in the Five Towns, why in Monroe, and even in 770? They're dancing. I don't know when was the last time that in Monroe and 770 they were dancing at the same time for the same reason. Maybe some Torah and Hashkafah. The dancing didn't start in Borough Park. The dancing didn't start in Lakewood. The dancing didn't start in Crown Heights in 770. The dancing started behind bars. That's where the dancing started. The miracle didn't start afterward. The miracle started before. He was just continuing. He was just going with the flow. He was free emotionally before. I'm telling you what happened to me. I was leaving at night. The guard was saying, "It's time to go, Rabbi. Out, out, out." He says, "You don't leave without a dance." So he starts a niggin. I say, "Start a niggin." He starts a Simchas Torah song. Ah, yeah, 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 yeah. And we're dancing in the cell. And I'm thinking to myself, why are we dancing? I'm not sure. Simchas Torah in the shuls here in New York, you have to find excuses for people to dance. They're free. They're good. You give the kids lollipops, flags, and this. You schlep them, they go a little down. Over there, he was dancing with such a chiyus, with such an energy. And then I remembered a story. I told him a story. Over there, I said the story. There were two brothers, the Rebbe Reb Zusha and the Rebbe Reb Melech, two students of the Maggid of Mizrachi. The Noyam Elimelech was Rebbe Elimelech of Lezhensk, and Reb Zusha of Anapoli. And they were traveling, and somebody informed upon them, and they ended up in prison. You'll forgive me, women. This is before the days of sanitary amenities. So there was a bucket in the corner of the room where people tended to their needs. In the morning, the Rebbe Reb Melech, the Noyam Elimelech, is weeping. So Reb Zusha says, "Why are you crying?" "Everything is b'hashgacha. Don't cry." He said, "I'm not crying for that." He says, "Why are you crying?" "I'm crying because it's the first time in my life since my bar mitzvah that I can't daven. I can't daven. Al pi halacha, according to halacha, if there's a reyach rav, there's a bad odor, and there's human fertilizer in front of you, you're not allowed to pray. You can't say Shema, you can't say Hashem's name. I can't daven." So Reb Zusha says, "Okay, so you won't daven. Why are you crying?" Says, "This is the first time in my life I need a daven in order to connect to Hashem. If I don't pray in the morning, I feel disconnected to reality. I feel disconnected to my own self. I feel disconnected from the core of the world. I feel disconnected from the soul of the cosmos, from truth, from God. I'm a fragmented person. I'm disoriented. I'm disjointed. I need prayer in order to align myself with my true self." So Reb Zusha looks at him, and in a classic yeshivish fashion, he says, "I don't understand you. The same God who wants you to daven, today, when there's such a smell in the prison, he wants you not to daven. In other words, not davening today is also a chalois. It's also a din. You're not davening because you're not davening. There's a din not to daven. Today, when you're not davening, you're fulfilling a halacha. There's a din. It's a halacha in Shulchan Aruch. If so, you're connecting to God today through not davening because you're fulfilling His will. Just like every day you connect through davening, today you connect through not davening." The Melech says, "Geschmack, I like." And instead of crying, he starts singing. They were two Hasidim, so they erupted and danced. The 40 Gentiles in the room saw two Jews dancing. They joined, and within 5 minutes, it looked like Purim and Simchas Torah in the prison cell. The warden hears the commotion, so he runs in, and he sees 40 people, matans, they're dancing, it's Lebedik. He calls over one of the Gentiles, and he says, "What's this dancing all about?" The Gentile points to the two Jews in the center of the circle, and he says, "They're guilty. They instigated it all. As usual, the Jews are guilty." The man says, "What is so exciting them? Why are they so happy?" And the Gentile points to the pail in the corner of the room. And the prison warden says, "Could anybody explain to me how that pail can trigger joy in anybody's soul or heart? It baffles me." And the Gentile says, "I don't know, some deep philosophical stuff, but somehow they explained to us that as a result of that bucket, they developed a new type of relationship with their God." In fact, they said that the bucket created a paradigm shift in their relationship with God. There was the pre-bucket relationship and the post-bucket relationship. And as a result of that bucket, the relationship morphed into an entirely new experience, which is so filled with romance and love that they're just crazy about it. And the prison warden says, really? They say, yeah, really. That's what they say. He says, I will teach them a lesson. What does he do? He takes the bucket. He throws it out of the room. So Rabbi Zusha turns to the Melech, he says, brother, now you can start davening. I told this story behind the door, behind the gates. As we finished dancing our Simchas Torah de Kinnigan. I said, that's you. What Rabbi Zusha was telling Rabbi Melech is that there's always a relationship. Sometimes the relationship looks one way. Sometimes the relationship looks very different. Sometimes God wants you to daven, sometimes He wants you not to daven. Moshe prays, sometimes He wants holuchas, and sometimes He tells Moshe, Yasher kaichacha sheshibarto. But in the Holy Ark, in the Holy of Holies, there weren't only the holuchas. The Gemara says in Baba Basra Yadalit, Luchos v'shivrei luchos monachim ba'aron. The Ark contained the whole tablet, and it also contained all of the broken pieces. All of them. You know, I was giving a lecture some time ago about education and children and dealing with children, etc. And you know, it's not so easy today. There's a lot of nisyonos and challenge. I mean, there were always, but today it's out in the open. This is a generation of exposure. For many years, things were under the rug. That's why we like to have Hollywood kitchens and wall-to-wall carpets, so we could put everything under the carpet. And we had to make sure the carpet goes from wall to wall. But recently, the new models in the homes is no carpets, and therefore things are more in the open. Whenever things come out in the open, it becomes painful. When the infection is hidden and you cover it with a Band-Aid, it looks good. Jews like when things look good, especially Orthodox Jews. We love when things look good. The problem is, you can't hide crimes, corruption, pain, politics, dysfunction, deception, dishonesty, insincerity for a long time. And our children are always the ones who bring out the best in us, or some of us call it the worst in us. But it's really the best in us, because it challenges us to really look at ourselves. You'll see it we see it in all of our lives. Our children are the ones who force us to look in the mirror in ways that we haven't before. I don't know of a parent today who's not being challenged by their children to look in the mirror very, very, very deeply. They say that there was once a couple that didn't have children, and there was this great Kabbalist who came from Jerusalem. So they went to see him, and he said, you know, tomorrow I'm going to Jerusalem. Give me your name and your mother's name. I'll put it in the kaisel, and I'll pray. And great, they give him the name, and he comes back 5 years later, and he meets the woman. And he says, knew anything? She says, yeah, Baruch Hashem, we have 10 children. He says, 10 children in 5 years? I mean, that's a little fast. She says, yeah, the first year triplets, the second year twins, then we decided we need a break. Then we had twins again, triplets again, Baruch Hashem, 10 children. He's like, wow, that's amazing, incredible what that note in the Kaisel accomplished. Where's your husband? I want to give him a hug. I want to say Mazel Tov. I want to make a Shechianu with him. She says, my husband is in Jerusalem. He says, what is he doing in Jerusalem? He went to the Kaisel. Why did your husband go to the Kaisel? He's looking for the note. He wants to take out the note. So children today are challenged. So I was giving, okay, you just got it, that's fine. I was giving this speech about our beloved children. And I finish. And you know Dr. Pelkovitz, Dr. David Pelkovitz, who's a frequent lecturer here in New York, a professor of psychology at YU, a therapist for 35 or 40 years. He comes over to me. And he says, I have to tell you a story. Usually when I finish a lecture, so people come over, Jews come over, and they say you were wrong. That's the minhag. That's the minhag by Jews. They explain why you were wrong. Either it was kfira or apikursus, or it's getting there. And why is it? So I was surprised to say, he's going to say, I'm going to go Tana de Messiah. I'm going to give you a raya that something I said that you were right. And he tells me that a quarter of a century ago, 25 years ago, he was sitting in his office. And a boy walks into his office. 16-year-old boy. He was sent there by his father. He needs therapy. He tells me, Dr. Belkowitz tells me, Rabbi Jacobson, sometimes you speak to somebody 5 minutes and you know he doesn't need therapy. His father needs therapy. This boy was unbelievable. He was great, a chevraman, smart kid. He says, I loved him right away. We finished the first session. I'm like, you don't need therapy. Bring in your father, your mother, bring in your siblings, and if you could, bring in your grandparents. I was a little surprised, I have to tell you. I was startled. I told Dr. Pelkman, I never heard of a therapist asking for a Zayda and Baba to come into therapy. What do you tell an 89-year-old grandmother? What are your feelings about your mother? We American brats have the luxury to have feelings all day about our mothers. We have nothing else to do. But our mothers or our grandmothers, if they had mothers, they were happy. It was survival. Who had the luxury to have feelings? Bichlal, especially for your mother. He says, you're right, but I had a hunch. And as a therapist, you got to follow your hunch. I said, okay. So what happened? The boy comes in next week with a whole beautiful family, a family from Flatbush, not too far from here. The father speaks. He asked the father to speak. Father says, I'll tell you my dilemma. My dilemma here is I have a beautiful family. And he starts extolling the virtues of his children as only fathers in New York know how to extol the virtues of their children. Basically, I have the perfect family. This one is Rosh Yeshiva, this one Rosh Kollel, this one Rosh Mesifta, this one Maggid Shiur, this one is the head of Atzalah, this one is the head of Mesherim, Mezamrim, Mesaskim. This is the biggest Baal Chesed who lived in the last millennium. This one is the greatest Askin of not only New York, but the whole tri-state area. This is the man, and my girls, unbelievable, valedictorian, by Sarah, by Srivka, by Sruchel, by Schana, by Yaakov, that this, and who they married la creme de la creme de la creme. These are my kids. Each of them, 6 years brisk, 11 years mir, 9 years pun. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. And I have one kid, my youngest, doesn't do anything, sleeps all day. Till 4 o'clock in the morning, he's in bed. Good head. 16 years old, he was already thrown out of 9 yeshivas. Not bad. 9 yeshivas, 16 years old. It's a shame. It's a shame for me, shame for the family, a shame for him. That's why we're here. As he's in the middle of his eulogy about the 16-year-old, the grandfather, the father's father gets up. And he says, I would like to say a few words about me, myself. I grew up in Poland. I grew up in a family of brothers, sisters. All the brothers would sit and learn in the Shtiblach in Poland. Little Beth Medrash, little shuls in Poland. They were wonderful. They were just incredible boys. And I was the black sheep in the family. Today, I would be diagnosed ADD, ADHD, PDD. But then, in 1938, there was no diagnosis. When we were children, there was no diagnosis. Everybody got the same treatment. You remember? Frask here, frask there. They pulled you by your ear, and you sat. Some of our teachers, you remember this one? With the stick on the finger? That's same you know what? For some, it actually helped. It was a pretty good diagnosis. Not for everybody, but for some, it was actually pretty good. Okay. But then my father would chastise me. You're wasting your time. I was savvy. I was street smart. I was out in the streets. It's 1938. And one day I pick up a book. And I read the book from cover to cover. And the name of the book is Mein Kampf by Adolf Hitler, Yamach Shemai. I come home and I say, Daddy, Tata, Poland is on the border of Germany. This man, the leader of Germany, is going to do everything he says in Mein Kampf. In a few years, there will not be a Jew left in Poland. Believe him what he writes. Let's take our family and run before it's too late. My father looks at me, and like most Jews in 1938, you know, hindsight is 20/20. In 1938, who knew, who imagined? You know what Jews used to say about Hitler in 1938? You ever heard from survivors? I'm a shugana, atzedreiter, a choiles nefesh. So haben am Misse schon, anach Meshuggah, anach Tzedreit. No, who took him seriously? My father said, stop with the Narishkeit, you're not learning. Learn. I said, listen, Father, I should be learning, but you know, I'm smarter than my brothers. I'm more savvy. I'm more sharp. I know reality when I see it. And I'm telling you, Poland is going to be the largest Jewish cemetery. Let's run. My father argued with me. And I told him, Tati, I'm going to have to run myself. I said goodbye to everybody. My mother, my father, all my siblings. And I ran. I crossed the Atlantic. I reached the United States of America. At the end of the war, I discovered that nobody in my family survived. I was the only survivor. I was alone in the world. As you know, I married. I built up a very successful business here in America. I'm doing very, very well. And today I look at my beautiful family and I look at my grandchildren and I ask myself one question: which one of my grandchildren resembles me most? Which one? And it's not hard for me to tell that it's this one. And he points to the 16-year-old who was sent to Dr. Breitowitz for therapy. He says, you are a replica of me in demeanor, in my facials, in my personality, in my ambitions, in my characteristics. And I say to all of you, my son, my daughter-in-law, my grandchildren, don't you dare disrespect this boy because you are alive today because of a boy like him. The reason you could sit and steig and learn and do mitzvahs and daven and sit and learn Torah and do all these wonderful things is because of a boy like him. Don't you look down at him. You owe your life to a boy like this. There is such electricity in the air. Everybody sits, he sits down. You could cut the tension. And Dr. Breitowitz tells me that was the end of the session. And that was the end of therapy for that boy. I look at him and I say, you can't keep me hanging in the middle of a story. I want to know the end. He says, the end is he took this boy into his business and he started to work for his grandfather. I said, okay, that's 25 years ago. Now what's now? He says, now, since then the grandfather has passed on. This boy runs the entire business, extremely successful, and all of his brothers are working for him. And then it hit me. It hit me. We often don't realize that every single one of our children, just like every single one of us, has their mission. And no two people are the same. And let's understand this very well. I was now in Israel. I went to visit a particular Monsey where they were demanding that everybody literally almost has to be the same. So I was speaking to the principal. And I said, forgive me, but I want to tell you something. The Gemara says that in Sdoim, they had one bed. You remember the story? And everybody had to fit that bed. If your feet were too long, they cut it. If you were too short, they stretched your feet. I want you to know that Sdoim is the same letters like Monsey. Because sometimes you have an institution that has one bed and everybody has to fit into that bed. What if the child is too long? No problem. We'll cut off his personality. We'll rip his heart out. We'll mutilate his passions. He's too short, we'll stretch him. Why do you think Judaism is so small? Why do we think that Judaism is so small that it has to look the same for every person? The Ishbitzer Rebbe says, Lo yisasa lechapeso. Don't turn Judaism into a fixed image that everybody has to be sculptured in that image. God is imageless, and that's why God could be reflected in infinitely different types of images. God doesn't have to be contained in a box. Judaism is infinite, to be able to encompass all colors, the entire rainbow of Klal Yisrael. Every soul has its mission, its journey, its unique talents, gifts, virtues, vices, struggles, and blessings. Each one of us is sent to this world with a particular shlichus, a particular mission, and nobody can replicate anybody else. We're all born originals, and yet so many of us die as copies. If you don't believe me, ask the mother of a boy named Abraham Avram Cohen, or he came to be known as Maurice Cohen. Maurice Cohen was born in Poland in 1887. A poor family in a shtetl. He was the black sheep of the family. He was a wild kid. He was what we call a street kid. He was a pickpocket. At the age of 11, he was eulogized as the greatest pickpocketer of the city. He was a bully. He would beat and get beaten. He learned to box. He was a ganav. It was so embarrassing for the family. At 16, they shipped him off to relatives in Canada at a farm. They thought at a farm with some cows and chickens, donkeys and geese, he'll become a mensch. But it didn't help. He was in the farm and he was doing his trouble there too. At the age of 16 in Canada, he was arrested. He learned to box. He pickpocketed. He was just a very, very big, what we call a troublemaker. He happened to befriend the Chinese. There was a poor Chinese community living in Canada, and he happened to befriend them. He started to eat at Chinese restaurants. He loved Chinese cuisine, which Jew doesn't. He loved their cuisine. But one day, a robber, a burglar, came into the Chinese restaurant and started to mug the owner. And this Maurice Cohen, Avram Cohen, a young bacher, beat the burglar, the thief, to a pulp, and overnight he became a hero in the Chinese community. So in 1912, when Sun Yat-sen, you know that name? When Sun Yat-sen comes to visit the Chinese in Canada from China, trying to overthrow the corrupt imperial government in China, his name was a classic yeshiva shename, Sun Yat-sen, to overthrow them. He is impressed by Maurice Cohen and he hires him as his bodyguard in Canada. And in 1925, when he actually overthrows the imperial Chinese government and he becomes the new president of China in 1925, he convinces Avram Cohen to come back to China to become his chief bodyguard and to run the entire operation of bodyguards, 250 bodyguards under him. And that's what he does. To the point he is once protecting the president and he's wounded, and therefore he's now carrying pistols in both of his hands, and they give him a nickname in China, Two-Gun Cohen. Two-Gun Cohen. Wasn't good enough for him with one hand, because he was wounded, he had another hand, he became Two-Gun Cohen. In fact, he rose to become one of the top personalities in the Chinese regime of the 1920s and the 1930s. He was an advisor. He had a tremendous position in the military, national security. He was a good mind, and the leaders were in love with him. In 1942, as Japan is fighting China in the middle of the Pacific War, he's captured by the Japanese. He's tortured terribly, and then with a prisoner exchanged, he's let free and he's shipped off back to Canada, where he goes in living a quiet life in Montreal, a Jew, Abe Cohen, Maurice Cohen. Very few people know the dramatic history of this Polish Yiddish king who ended up in China, and they used to call the unofficial Jewish king of China. Comes November 1947. It's barely 2 years since the Holocaust. 6 million Jews were decimated, exterminated. A third of Jewry, most of Eastern European Jewry, went up in the flames of the crematoriums of the Germans, Yamach Shema. At last, the United Nations is going to convene over the question if Jews are entitled to their own homeland in what was then called Palestine under the British mandate. To create a new state, you need 2/3 of the vote of the United Nations, the General Assembly, but before that, you need to first be approved by the Security Council. One of the members of the Security Council was China. China had the veto power. And everybody knew it's not even going to get to the UN general vote because it's going to be vetoed in the Security Council because of the relationship of China and the Arab countries. And when the Security Council voted and China abstained, everybody was shocked. How in the world did they get China to abstain? It went to the UN, to the General Assembly, and you know the rest of the story. November 1947, Hanukkah, Motzei Shabbos, the UN votes for the creation of a state of Israel. They want a partition. The Arabs say no, which develops into a war. 1948 comes. Israel declares the state based on the UN declaration. How did China abstain? What happened? What happened was there was one Jew who knew Morris Cohen is the address. They called him up in Montreal and they said, Avrem Aleh, we have an issue. China is going to veto. What do we do? He says, who is the Chinese representative in the UN? In the Security Council. They tell him, General Yu. He starts laughing. They said, why are you laughing? He says, I made him general. I made him general. He drives to New York. He meets General Yu over coffee. And the next day, General Yu abstains. And the state of Israel comes into being. So there's close to 6-7 million Jews today living in their homeland. But the way it happened under natural circumstances is because that little kid, that bum in the streets, who ended up in China as a bodyguard and caused the Chinese to abstain in November 1947. Now, if you were the mother of Maurice Cohen, and somebody would say, wow, what nachas. You're schmoozing in one of these restaurants here over coffee. So what is your son doing? Oh, he went to the Mir. What is your son? He went to Brisk. What is your son doing? He got accepted to Harvard, and he to Stanford, to Brown, to Yale. Where did he go? Oh, he's already here. He went to this yeshiva, he went to that yeshiva, he went to this university, he went to this program, he went to this college, he went to this yeshiva, Hesda, he went to Shalavim, he went to Karabayav, wherever he went, yeshiva Takoto, whatever. I know different types, different tastes, different folks. I don't mean to discriminate against anybody. Wherever he went to eat falafel in Jerusalem. And if we turn to the mother of Mrs. Cohen, he'd say, and where did your Avremela go? He went to China. Oh, there's a yeshiva in China? Chabad made a yeshiva in China already? No. He went to be the bodyguard. He went to be the bodyguard of Son Yat-Son. He needed a bodyguard. Who could he find? So he found Morris Cohen. And I'm sure the mothers, the yachnas, would look and say, oh, Hashem should help. Hashem should help. Because we have a very limited perspective of our children. You never know. God had a whole different mission for this boy. Israel owes its existence to this Chinese bodyguard, literally. And he himself didn't know it till he was close to the age of 60. A completely different mission. And let's understand this. When the Torah says in Miketz Vayakir Yosef es Echa v'hem lo yikiru, Yosef recognized his brothers, but they didn't recognize him. So the Baal HaTanya says, what does it mean? It means they never recognized him. They didn't understand his Weltanschauung because he had a completely different interpretation of what Yiddishkeit is. You see the Shvatim, as they told Paroi, we were always shepherds. They always lived in isolation. They wanted to live in isolation because they believed that Judaism can flourish best when Jews are insulated, when Jews are isolated, when Jews keep to themselves. Yosef had a whole different vision. As a young boy, he was dreaming that all the sheaves are bowing down to him, and the sun, and the moon, and the stars. And they looked at Yosef and they said, who are you? This is not Yiddishkeit. You may be the closest thing to Judaism, but you're not Judaism. They looked down at him. They never recognized him. They could never understand him. He had a completely different vision. For him, the vision of Judaism was to change the world, to revolutionize the landscape of planet Earth. They couldn't appreciate it. For them, Judaism meant remaining cloistered and insulated. I once asked a rabbi in a particular community, what's your mission statement with your community? He said 3 things. I match them, I hatch them, and I dispatch them. That's it. The orbit of life. That's what we do. When Yosef tells his brothers, go back to my father and tell him, Samani Elokim la'adin al kol eretz Mitzrayim. God made me a master over all of Egypt. So the Rishonah says, this is nachas? You know your father. You think he cares that you became the prime minister of Egypt? Tell your father that you did daf yomi every day. Tell him that you went to the mikveh every day. Tell him you put on Rabbeinu Tam's tefillin. Tell him you never missed a mincha. What are you telling him? You graduated MIT physics. You know your father, Ish Tom. He's a Ben Torah. Give him a little nachas. Don't tell him you became the prime minister of a superpower. He doesn't care. So the Rishonah says what Yosef meant was, Samani Elokim la'adin al kol eretz Mitzrayim means, I made God a master over the entire land of Egypt. Yosef is the one in the Tanakh. Every conversation he has in Egypt, he opens up talking about Hashem. Look at it. Potiphar's wife asks him to sleep with her, Shichva, and what does he say? I can't sin to God. And the butler and the baker tell him they had a bad dream, and he says, God will give you the answer. And Paro says, I had a horrible dream, and he says, Elokim yanes loim Paro. He is Tzamani Elokim la'adin al kol eretz Mitzrayim. Yosef has a completely different vision. L'sakin oilam b'malchus shindal yud. The Shvatim believe that the Jews will grow if they're isolated. That's one derech. And the debate continues in Jewish life. There are those paths in Klal Yisrael who believe that Jews must be insulated and isolated. And those who say, no, the Jew has the duty and the responsibility to transform the landscape of planet Earth. The whole world is waiting to place its mouth in the mouth of the Jew and declare together, Yizgadol v'Yizkada Shmei Rabba. But you could look at Yosef and say, Nebach, what a horrible, horrible kid. V'aviv shamar es hadavar. Yaakov understood that Yosef's shlichus, Yosef's journey is different. Somebody once asked me if there's any humor in Chumash. They said, why isn't there more humor in davening and more humor in Chumash? I said, there's plenty of humor. Davening always finishes with a beautiful, humorous anecdote. Talmidei chachamim marbim shalom ba'olah. They said, what about Chumash? I said, Chumash also has wonderful humor. Yehuda was screaming that Yosef is the kid who's deteriorating. And he's deteriorating the family. That's what he always screamed. As I said, the black sheep, v'heim lo yikiru. So the Chumash gives us a little humor. Yehuda and Yosef both leave the family. And they both encounter women who don't belong to them. Yehuda reacts in one way, and Yosef, the black sheep, Yosef the reject, Yosef the one who couldn't make it, Yosef the disappointment, is the one who in the thicket of darkness, the Muzdi Yoiknoi Shal Yaakov Rabba Chaloin, he sees the image of his father in the window, and he says, no, Vayemoin. And everybody asks, what did he see in the window? What did he see? Was Yaakov interviewed on CNN and he saw his picture? He didn't know what Yaakov looked like. It means, my friends, the word Vayemoin is 3 times in Bereshis. You have it in Vayechi, and you have it twice in Vayeshev. It says, Vayemoin, Yosef refused the wife of Potiphar, and it says also, Vayemoin lehisnachem. Yaakov refused to be comforted. Why? Rashi says you can only find comfort for somebody who died, not somebody who was alive. Everybody was telling Yaakov, your son is dead spiritually. Yaakov said, my son is not dead, my son is alive. He refused to be comforted because he refused to stop believing that his son is spiritually alive. And because he refused to stop believing in his child, therefore, Vayemoin, hundreds of miles away, Yosef refused to stop believing in himself. When you have a father who believes in you, you can believe in yourself. When you have a mother who believes in you, they allow you, they empower you to believe in yourself. At that moment of truth, Yosef saw the image of a father who refused to stop believing in him, who refused to accept the notion that his son is a black sheep, who knew that his son is on a mission His son is on a shlichus. His son was not sold. His son was sent. It may be a different journey. It may be a different mission, but a mission it is. And indeed, 22 years later, Yosef says 3 times, I wasn't sold. I was sent. A few years ago, I got a very strange call from the Pentagon. It was an interesting call. Somebody's on from the Pentagon and they say, are you the Jewish Billy Graham? I'm like, so I said, yes. I said, okay, we want to invite you to be the keynote speaker for they have a weekly retreat for the chief of chaplains of the entire U.S. Army. The Army, the Navy, the Air Force come together for a week of spiritual rejuvenation. For 50 years, they have a keynote speaker. You're invited to be the keynote speaker this year. I'm thinking to myself, how does a nice Brooklyn Jewish boy end up as the Jewish Billy Graham? I have a neighbor on my block where I grew up on Montgomery Street in Brooklyn. His name is Yankel Goldstein, Colonel Goldstein, a colonel in the U.S. Army for 30, 40 years. The only one they allowed to have payas and a beard. He calls me up, he says, by the way, from now on you're the Jewish Billy Graham. I said, what are you talking about? He said, I'll tell you what happened. God runs this world in very interesting ways. I was summoned to the first Iraq War to serve as a chaplain, a Jewish chaplain. You remember the first Iraq War from Bush the father? You remember? January 1991. January 91. Tafshin on Aleph, Shvat. The first Iraq War. Norman Schwarzkopf was the commander-in-chief, and I still remember they asked him, according to your philosophy, should we forgive terrorists? And he said, it's not our job, it's God's job. Our job is to arrange the meeting. So Yankel Goldstein tells me, I came there. And when I come, the chief of chaplains of all the Iraqi forces is a man named Douglas L. Carver. He turns to me, he says, you're the only Jewish guy here. Who are you going to sleep with? Everybody else is Christian, Protestants, ministers, Baptists, Catholics, Episcopalian, Mormon. Who are you going to sleep with? He says, I don't have anybody. He says, you'll be with me. So for 6 weeks, till the war was over, Purim, if you remember, Yankel Goldstein, a Chassidish Yid from Brooklyn, is together with the Baptist Douglas Carver in the same tent. Life moves on. Goldstein continues in the army. Carver is appointed to the highest position, chief of chaplains of the entire U.S. Army. Calls up Goldstein one day, 20 years later. He said, 50 years we have Billy Graham giving us inspiration. I had enough. I want to know who's the Jewish Billy Graham. He says, oh, my neighbor, YY Jacobson is the Jewish Billy Graham. He calls me up, he says, that's why you're the Jewish Billy Graham. I said, fine, no problem, just don't tell my mother-in-law, and we'll be good. Do me a favor, I don't need Saras with Nadin. She's going to say, I thought we were marrying Jacobson, not Graham. I said, fine, good. I thought the event will be in 3 weeks, 4 weeks. I thought it was a Jewish organization. I say, when is the event? They tell me 2 years. And then I realized I'm not dealing with Jews. Jews usually call that day, if you're lucky, a night before. Okay, Nachi Gordon a few months before, but not more. Real Goyim, you prepare 3, 4 years in advance, and it's wonderful. So I prepare, I come to Hilton Head, South Carolina. Okay. I ask General Carver, what time is my keynote address? Usually keynotes by us are 8 o'clock at night, 9 o'clock at night. He tells me 8 o'clock in the morning. I said, a keynote 8 o'clock? He says, yes, sir. I say, okay. So I'll come here 7:45. He says, no, you should be here at 6. I realized I'm dealing with Gentiles. I said, what do I do from 6 to 8? Goldstein wanted to kill me. I said, what do you mean? You sit. What do you do? Anyway, he's saluting everyone. I'm saluting everybody. He says, you stop saluting because you don't know how to salute. And if you do the wrong salute, they can give you 250 push-ups, 400 push-ups, 350 push-ups. I say, okay, 6 o'clock is 6 o'clock. What should I do? Goldstein tells me, I'm waking you up 5. I say, what? Ganuk 6, why 5? He says, you have to daven. Signs I'm 5. 4:15, he wakes me up. I have Chalav Yisrael, so you can have a coffee. I'm already almost finished davening. I'm like, God Almighty, what do you bring me here to Hilton Head? 6 o'clock, I'm down. I sit 2 hours like a real idiot looking at the beams, at the walls. I became acquainted with the room, the energy. I counted the bricks, everything. Ich sitz, 8 o'clock sharp. I'm called up. I'm summoned. I speak. They told me to speak for an hour. I spoke for an hour. And I compared the first I said the first chaplain of history was Joseph. He was the chaplain in the prison, and the definition of a chaplain is when you see two people depressed, you ask them why you're depressed. Ma'adua pneichem ra'im haya. So that's your job as chaplains. I spoke for an hour. I thanked America. I thanked them. My topic was fear and faith in times of crisis. I finished. Douglas Carver gets up to thank me. And he says, I watched Rabbi Jacobson speak. This type of passion you usually don't find by them. And I have to tell you, my friends, I love Jews. I love Jews. I even married a Jew. And my mother happens to be Jewish too. And even my father is Jewish. But it's much easier to talk to Gentiles. First of all, they all shut their phones. Jews, you're not allowed to. Netanyahu might call you. Trump may call you. Rabashkin may call you. You never know. So therefore, Jews don't shut phones. The more you ask, the more they resist. Who does he think he is to control my life? Rabbis should not be controlling the lives of congregants. Gentiles don't think that way. The second thing with Gentiles is they actually listen to speeches. Jews don't. Jews have opinions about speeches. Think about even you guys. You're sitting here, right? You're not listening. Every Jew sitting here is, oh, I heard that joke already. He said it last time. Can't he say any new stories? And if you never heard it, you're like, that's pretty good. I think I'm going to use it tomorrow. I'm going to steal it. Shabbos, I need to speak. I'm going to steal it. It's not bad. It's pretty boring. You know, usually it's good today. Jews don't listen. They form opinions. Gentiles listen. Jews sit like this. Every Jew sits. Look at yourself. Let's see if you can impress me. Let's see. Not one rabbi in history impressed me. Not one rabbi ever. I'm at a Kiddush club since 2. Let's see what you're going to do. That's how Jews are. But Gentiles are not like. Also, Jews are scared to convey passion. You know that, right? The most you'll get from a Jew at the end of a speech is shkoyach. Shkoyach, shkoyach, shkoyach. Not bad. Shkoyach. Shkoyach. Gentiles, they sit at the edge of their seats and they were like, yes, Rabbi, yay, go, amen. At the end of every sentence, hallelujah. It was a machaya. Mamash machaya. And I finish. Carver gets up and he says, this passion Rabbi Jacobson has, he doesn't have it from the Jews. He got it from the Baptists. He must have spent time with the Baptists, learning how to communicate. And all the priests, thousands of chaplains are giggling. They're all giggling. And I'm standing on the stage, and suddenly Jewish guilt enters my heart. And you know exactly what this guilt looked like. The Jewish guilt tells me, he said you spent time by the Baptists. That means Lamaris Ayin, they're going to think that you went to the Baptist, which is a gather of Avodah Zarah. So it's like Mamash Achilul Hashem. You know all that, right? Never happens to you? You don't speak for the Pentagon, right? And then I'm like, don't be a nerd. The guy just was joking. The guy was just saying that, Baptist. You ever hear Baptists preach? No? Okay. Tonight. He was just joking. And then I'm like, but even a joke, it's Avodah Zarah. Anyway, you know when the Jewish guilt can drive you crazy? You go back and forth. Oh my God. I'm like, the guy made a joke, let it go. And then I say to myself, it's not a joke. It's very serious. So what, should I interrupt him? I interrupt him, I have to do 800 push-ups. And I know I'm in shape, and I'm good looking, and I'm slim, and I'm handsome, but 800 push-ups is pushing it. Then I say to myself, truth be told, Jews in the history of Jews often had to sacrifice their lives, literally not to embrace Christianity. And it's the only reason I'm alive today and we're here today. Because of our ancestors who for years sacrificed their lives for Yiddishkeit. I am in free America in the 21st century. He said, I was by the Baptists. It's not about me. They didn't call me because of my looks or my brains. They called me as a representative of the Jewish people. I have to say something. It was embarrassing. I knew it's not going to engender a good reaction. I'm going to interrupt the general. I'm going to tell him he was wrong in the middle of a speech after he's complimenting me, after I got a very nice applause. It's really not nice. But then I said, you know what? I have no choice. This is what I have to do. So I interrupt. This is all a millisecond, you understand, right? Didn't take more than a millisecond. I interrupted him. I still remember I was afraid. I interrupted him on the stage. And I said, General Carver, you're wrong. The Baptists learned it from us. I got a standing ovation. They were applauding. And I'm looking and I'm like, this is strange. When he said that I was a Baptist, they giggled. They all giggled. When I said, you're wrong, the Baptists learned it from us, they gave me a thundering applause. I was trying to make sense of it. And then I realized, when I said that you learned it from us, it made them feel comfortable in their own skin. And I understood then the great truth that if the world will ever come to respect Jews, it's when Jews will respect themselves. If Jews will ever come to love Israel, it's when Israel will learn to love itself. If the world will ever come to admire the Jewish people, it's when the Jewish people admire the Jewish people, its heritage and faith. It's like Dr. Twersky told me when he was... Sorry, not quite. Hallelujah, Rabbi Yay! Dr. Twersky told me that he was on an airplane and a Jewish woman looks at him and says, in Yiddish, you know Dr. Twersky, Rabbi Abraham Twersky, he has a round black hat, square black beard, long black coat, frock. She looks at him and she says in Yiddish, you are the cause of anti-Semitism. You dress differently. You look differently, you behave differently. If only you would be like everybody else, they would love us. He looks at her and he says, I don't understand the verbiage of your dialect. In which language are you communicating? She says, Yiddish. He says, I am Amish. She says, oh, I thought you were Hasidic. He says, no, I'm Amish. She says, wow, I love the Amish. He says, why? She says, you're a minority, but you maintain your heritage with so much dignity and pride. Kudos. Now it was his turn to respond in Yiddish. He says, if I would have been Amish, you'd love me. Now that I'm a Jew, you're embarrassed by me. I bless you that you should be able to appreciate in your own people what you can appreciate in other people. This was the argument between Yosef and his brothers. Yosef understood that the mission of the Jew is to change the world. We have among our youth today unbelievable skill, unbelievable power, unbelievable personality, unbelievable depth. When I take my child and I squash him and I crush him and I force him to be what he's not, it's not only he can't grow, the world is deprived of his gift. What would happen if Mozart would grow up in a home without a piano? What would happen? Where would the genius go? It would go somewhere. He would climb walls. He would firebomb his yeshiva. Thank God Mozart had a piano, and his genius, his creativity, had an outlet. Every Jewish child is a Mozart. The Gemara says it in Shabbos Kuf Yutes. Al tigui b'meshichai elu tinoikas shel beis Rabba. Every Jewish child is a little Mashiach, meaning somebody who can impact the world. As we grow up, we're told, forget your dreams, crush your dreams, destroy your dreams. So the Gemara says, Al tigui b'meshichoi. Don't touch the child in you. Don't repress your dreams. Don't stop dreaming. Don't surrender to mediocrity. Don't live lives of quiet desperation. Don't allow the pain of life, the turmoil of life, the anxiety of life, the psychological challenges of life to keep you down, to snuff out of you the spirit of Mashiach, to be able to bring redemption a step closer. Don't do that, and realize wherever you are and wherever you were sent, you were never sold. You were sent. And that's why I am moved to be part of an event that celebrates the meaningful minute. Because Nachi Gordon, the founder of the Meaningful Minute, and his colleagues know that unlike Baptists, Jews don't know how to listen. A minute? Maybe. Also, people are complaining. Attention span of most Jewish audiences today, present company excluded, always. Attention span of most Jewish audiences is 12 seconds. Some audiences, 6 seconds. Some audiences, 0. When I started to speak, I was told, a joke you can repeat once a year. A story once in 2 years. They'll remember it for 2 years. A Dvar Torah, twice in the same sermon. So some people like to kvetch. Instead of kvetching, he said, you know what? They want a minute? We'll give it to them in a minute. Truth doesn't take more than a minute. So you want to know why I just spoke for an hour and a half? Good question. Ask my therapist. But truth doesn't take more than a minute. You'll see. All the early speeches in Chumash, a minute. How long do you think Matan Torah took? How long does it take to say 10 commandments? How long did Matan Torah take? Anybody knows? Maybe a minute and a half. So why are rabbis talking for hours? Beats me. So you put it in a minute. And that minute empowers Jews. It lifts up Jews. And what's the greatest way of empowering Jews? Telling them you're never alone and you're never hopeless. You're always an ambassador of love, light, and hope. Thank you so much.